Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, Book 1, Chapter 13, continued, looking now at sections 21 through 23. Here, after having laid the groundwork for a robust and biblical theology of the Trinity, and although he's highlighted and confronted errors in general, now he's going to come primarily to the error of Servetus, an anti-Trinitarian heretic of his own day and age, who held erroneous and ultimately heretical views regarding the essence and doctrine of God, particular to the Trinity. So, to highlight some general things Calvin does in this chapter, is he basically says, look, every age of the church has had to deal with anti-Trinitarian concepts of God that have crept in. It's like this ember that's continually got some life in it that each age tries to fan into a flame. And he says one of the general ways in which we notice or need to address this error is many times we can sympathize with the desire, at least in part, even though not where it leads, and that many of the heretics and errors that arise come from a desire to clarify the nature of God and the essence of God presented in Scripture. However, they fail on both fronts. They commit error in terms of how God reveals himself, and they don't actually clarify. That is, we're commended to come up to the point that Scripture has guided us about God's own self-disclosed revelation, and we're not to profess less than what God has revealed and how he's told us he is, and we definitely don't go beyond the point as well. And so many of the anti-Trinitarian errors that creep in and that each church age has to deal with boil down to they approach Scripture that presents the essence and mystery of who God is in his nature, which is at least in part to finite man incomprehensible. And instead of just taking it as mystery and moving on with their lives, they attempt to clarify. And in that attempt to clarify, they introduce confusion, error, and ultimately absurdity. Calvin will highlight in this middle section in particular that Servetus is one in particular who has done that. What did Servetus do and teach at the time of Calvin? That essentially God, in communicating about himself as Father, Son, and Spirit, is merely using a figure of speech, and that we shouldn't, in some sense, take it too seriously. That Servetus would say it's part of God's accommodation. It's not a real part of his nature, and therein lies his error. However, we can begin to critique it and pick it apart even more because, like with so many errors and heresies, it doesn't stop short of the point of general error, but it proceeds onward and onward. That is, Servetus's view, as he logically tries to give it cohesion and to make a cogent argument and case for himself, begins to introduce new errors that spring out of this error of God's essence as Trinity. That is, Servetus would also say, in logically boiling down that God is just using figures of speech here, that actually God as transmutes or transfuses his divine essence to Son and Spirit, and it doesn't end there. It also, in some sense, resides in us and resides in the trees and the bees and the stars and the seas and everything else, basically devolving down into pantheism. However, he just started by basically saying Father, Son, and Spirit are figures of speech, but what does he end up coming to? A form of pantheism, and even more, that he could say, yikes, something as scary as the spirits of the faithful are now co-eternal and co-substantial with God. That's where error and heresy leads. We need to come to the point that Scripture leads us, and we don't speak less than what it says. We profess the faith, but we obviously don't go beyond it. In Servetus, we can highlight a misapprehension of God's own self-disclosure and person, deconstruct that error and refute it, and then also take note of the very serious errors that spring out from it. It's like a poison distributed throughout. we cannot wrongly conceive of God, that we won't begin to have serious misapprehensions of ourselves and the creation that he's given. He goes on to say a little more, but in some sense, it's treading the same ground he's already done in the previous 20 sections of this chapter. So I will leave it at that. I hope that was beneficial to you in looking at Servetus and Calvin's addressing of his anti-Trinitarian error. Thanks for listening.